and shelter. Oh, the average income in America, the average income is now $5,000 less than the cost of basic needs. And this is what I see in the countryside. I see people, families sitting at their kitchen table, with anxiety attacks, trying to figure out how they're going to pay the bills and make the bills work. And I have friends who are changing the ingredients that they buy at the grocery store in order to get through the checkout line. And we're seeing this all over the country. We're seeing people having to make these impossible choices. And what they're doing is they're putting on their credit card bills. And under Trump and Biden, we have built up the biggest credit card debt in American history. They added $300 billion to American credit card debt, and the credit card companies are charging 22%. If the mafia did that, it would be called loan sharking. But the banks get away with it, and the banks get away with everything. I'm going to just tell you something very briefly that happened. I have a friend, I've represented for most of my career as an environmental lawyer. I represented commercial fishermen. That's how I started out doing environmental law in the Hudson River, but all over the country. And one of my closest friends, a commercial fisherman named Keith Amato, who fished out of Wellfleet on the Cape. He fished out of Chatham and P-Town. And he ran a business his whole life, and he worked in the industry his whole life. His son-in-law now runs the business, but he doesn't have a pension, and he doesn't have money to live on, and he has full disability because it was a tough life that he lived. He was dependent on food stamps. He was getting $283 a month for food stamps. But in the last 2 years, because paying for the war, the $16 trillion that we paid for the lockdowns, that's $24 trillion with the wars and the lockdowns together, that's turned into inflation. Inflation is the way that you tax the poor. Oh, his food stuff, the average price of food in the last 2 years has gone up 38%. But the price of basic foods, dairy, milk, and chicken, has gone up 76%. So his food stamps are buying 76% less than they were buying 2 years ago. And, he was already struggling with recipes, etc. On March 1st of this year, he got a robocall from the government saying, we are cutting your food stamps to $23 a month, 90%. 30 million Americans got that call. 15 million Americans lost their Medicare that same month. That same month, we topped off our commitment to Ukraine at $113 billion. The amount of money that it would take to pay the Medicare and the food stamps is the $113 billion. We're borrowing $6 billion a day from the Chinese and Japanese to pay for the Ukraine. Our entire budget for EPA is $12 billion a year. The entire budget for CDC is $12 billion a year. And we sent $113 billion abroad for a war that was unnecessary. The Russians all tried to settle that war with us on two occasions. One, the Minsk Accords, beginning in 2014, which France agreed to, Germany agreed to, and Putin agreed to. And Zelensky in 2019 ran. Here's a guy who is a comedian and an actor, okay, which I'm not ridiculing because that's what my wife does, so I'm not going to do that. But he had never been in politics, and he ran and he won. Why did he win? Because he promised to sign the Minsk Accords and settle the war peacefully. He was the peace candidate. He was going to sign with the Russians. All the Russians wanted was that we don't put NATO in the Ukraine, and he agreed to do that. And Donbass would become a semi-autonomous region inside of Ukraine, but they would allow to continue to speak their own language, and that's all they wanted. So, and he said he was going to sign it. But we, the neocons in the White House, Victoria Nuland, Avril Haines, Anthony Blinken told Zelensky he couldn't sign it. And then the Russians, offered, when they go in, they sent 40,000 people in. And they clearly don't want to take over the country because you can't do that with 40,000 troops, 3.5 million people in Kiev. They wanted us back at the negotiating table. In March 2022, Zelensky came back to the negotiating table and they negotiated a peace agreement that was based upon the same parameters as the Minsk Accords. This was all hidden from us until 2 months ago when we found this out. And in March of 2022, they signed it, they initialed it. Zelensky initialed it and the Russians initialed it, and the Russians began removing their troops. But President Biden sent Boris Johnson over there to torpedo the deal because we wanted the war with the Russians.
Rubbish.
And this is true. And Lloyd Austin that month, the Secretary of Defense, said that when he was asked, what are we doing in Ukraine? He said, we are there to exhaust the Russian army and degrade its capacity to fight anywhere else in the world. President Biden, when he was asked, said regime change in Russia. Well, that may be something that the neocons want, or somebody else wants, but it's not something that's good for the Ukrainians. And I want to tell you, my son went over to Ukraine and fought on the side of Ukraine. He joined the Foreign Legion, and he joined a special forces group, and he fought as a machine gunner in the offensive, in the Kharkiv offensive, and he was engaged in firefights almost daily with Russians, and he was fighting on behalf of the Ukrainians because he admired their valor, and he also understood, nobody likes Putin. Putin was provoked, but he did not need to. He had other options other to invade Ukraine. I'm not justifying Putin's invasion, but we need to recognize our provocations. And my uncle said, President Kennedy, during the Cuban Missile Crisis and elsewhere, when all of his 11 of the 13 people on the ex-con committee wanted him to invade Cuba. And he said to them, if we invade, we're going to have to first bomb the 64 Russian gun sites where they have missiles. And he said, are the gun sites armed now with nuclear warheads? The CIA didn't know. And he said, are we going to have to kill Russian troops? Are there Russian troops manning those gun emplacements? The CIA said, we think there's 600 of them. And my uncle said, if we kill the Russian troops, isn't Khrushchev going to have to invade Berlin? And they said, we don't think he has the guts to do that. So that was the wager they were willing to make. My uncle wasn't willing to do that. And so he figured out a different way to sell it with Khrushchev, and he developed a relationship with Khrushchev then, where they started writing each other letters. They both realized they were in the same position. They were surrounded by people who wanted them to go to war. And it was their job as leader. Both of them had been in the war. Khrushchev had a brutal time in the Stalingrad, which was the worst battle of the war. My uncle was the only president ever in the White House who won the Purple Heart. And they they knew what war was. And they knew they had to talk to each other. And they began exchanging letters secretly. There was a spy that used to come to our house when I was a boy called Georgy Bolshakoi, and we loved him because he would do the Cossack dancing for us, and he would do rope climbing contests with my dad. But he played this key role where Khrushchev trusted him and began sending letters to my uncle secretly. And they exchanged 26 letters to each other. And then they installed hotlines. When I grew up in the Summer White House, which was in the compound right next to my house, my brother now owns it, and the wires are still coming out of the wall, but they installed a red phone that was a hotline. And we knew if we picked up that phone that Khrushchev would answer. And there was one in the White House as well. But they knew they needed to talk to each other. And my uncle said, if you want to avoid war, you have to understand your adversary. And we now today need to learn from that lesson. We need to start talking to the Russians. the Russians have more nuclear weapons than we do. They have 1,000 more weapons, and they have better weapons than we do. They particularly have ABM weapons that are far superior to ours. So they can avoid getting bombed much better than we can. And it's crazy for us to engage to play chicken like they were urging my uncle to do in '62 with a nuclear power. And we are forcing Russia into this terrible alliance with China, which is the worst foreign policy outcome that we could possibly have. And we've started, we've created now BRICS, which we've turned 40 other nations away from us, including our traditional friends, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, 38 other nations who are switching off the U.S. currency and switching to China. And if we lose our status as world reserve currency, it's the end of the U.S. economy. So we're playing with all of these forces in a way that it seems that people don't understand them.
Yeah, I don't.
And we've killed 350,000 Ukrainian kids, the kids who were fighting alongside my son, who didn't need to die. And this was an avoidable war.
Yes.
And if I'm president, I'm going to settle the war. And I'm going to end the bloodshed. And I'm going to unfund the empire. And invest in a home and begin investing it again in the American middle class and rebuild this country at home. My wife and I were talking about it. She would say, my wife grew up very, very poor. And we were talking about this epidemic of anxiety and mental illness and alcoholism and depression that is accompanying the poverty that we see all over our country. And she said, before she got her big job, her big break, if she saw the engine light go on in her car, that she felt almost suicidal. Because she knew that she was going to have to make choices. There are people in this country today who are choosing between food and their medicine, and their food and their gasoline. And my friend wrote me a text this week, and he said, I'm down to one meal a day. There's a lot of Americans who are in that position, and there are young couples like the kid I met who have no hope of getting a home. Now the home prices have gone from $200,000 2 years ago, average, to $400,000 today. And the interest rates have gone up 5 times. None of these kids are going to be able to buy a home. The American promise is not available to them. And there are couples who are sitting in their living room and they're listening to a baby crying in the room next door and having to wonder whether that child is $50 sick or $100 sick or $500 sick before they bring them, or $1,500 sick before they bring them to an emergency room. And that's not the America that I grew up proud of. I want my kids to grow up proud of this country and with the hope that they'll be able to live lives that are at least as rich and prosperous and as the ones that all of us grew up with. So I'm going to shut up now. Again, I want to thank all of you for coming. I'd love to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kennedy. We're going to take questions, and if you have a question, raise your hand, and I'll come to you.